Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation today. Our topic is on creating online spaces for LGBTQ plus youth. My name is Jenna Hackman. I am the Director of Online Programming at Gender Spectrum. I use they or she pronouns, and I've been involved with Gender Spectrum for about 4 years, and a lot of my work has been focused on really trying to find ways to build community and access to resources in an online space, particularly for trans, non binary, and gender expansive youth. And so we wanted to create this presentation because we have been getting a lot of questions in the past week connected to COVID-19. And I know a lot of LGBT centers and schools and places where folks are working with queer and trans youth are really thinking about if there are ways to provide resources in a virtual or digital space. And so we wanted to create this presentation to just share a little bit of learnings with you all around the ways that we run online groups for youth and parents, share some of the things that we've learned along the way, and hopefully provide you all with some practical skills to take back into whatever is the work that you're doing. We had a webinar yesterday and we decided to do a second recording of this presentation. There were a lot of questions that came in through the chat. And I realized afterwards that folks who were listening to the recording wouldn't really be able to access those questions. So this is a separate recording. If you joined the webinar yesterday, this is the same content. We're just going to incorporate some of the chat questions at the end since you all aren't able to participate in real time. And one other thing I wanted to say is that I know this is a really, really challenging and stressful time for a lot of us. We're all kind of navigating this new normal. And I really thought that it was great that we put out this webinar to sign up for on Friday, and we had over 600 people sign up in the last, 6 days. And I just say that because I think, during these times, it can be really nice to hold on to some of the positives. And to me, the fact that there were that many people out there that are, really feeling an urgency to support queer and trans youth, I think is just so, so special. So just wanted to name that as we start. Okay, so a little bit about Gender Spectrum. I think some of you are probably familiar with us and some of you are not. So just a little bit about who we are. So we are based in the Bay Area, but we do work on a national level and also some international work with our online programs. And our mission is really around creating a gender inclusive world for all children and youth. So we really look at gender as this aspect that impacts all of us and impacts all kids, and then also kind of hone in on what does that specifically look like for trans, non-binary, and gender expansive young people. And so the main areas that we work in are, we do a lot of work with organizations to kind of increase understandings around gender. So a lot of work with school districts, mental health providers, doctors, really anyone who's working with youth in some capacity. And then we also do work with families. So whether that's the youth themselves or parents who are wanting to support a loved one who's maybe, thinking about their gender, siblings. So we kind of work with everyone that sort of like is supporting a young person in some way. Okay, so the goals of this presentation are a few different things. We can only get to so much in about an hour, but these are the things that I felt like were themes that came in a lot of the questions that folks asked in their sign-up forms, and some of the things that we felt were most important to share with you all. So we're going to talk a little bit about the virtual spaces that we currently run for trans and non-binary youth and parents, and just share a little bit around what that model looks like for us. We're also going to highlight some key things that we've learned along the way in this online work. I think the internet can be kind of a wild place and you never really know what's going to land well and what isn't. So we definitely want to share just some of the things that we've learned along the way. And then the last piece is hopefully we'll be able to provide you all with some concrete tips and tricks for moving forward. I know a lot of people are feeling a bit of a sense of urgency around this work and really wanting to support the youth that maybe are at home right now. And so hopefully we'll be able to provide some things for you all that will help you kind of move that forward in whatever way kind of best fits the work that you're doing. Okay, so I wanted to start off by just naming that we definitely won't have all the answers. I think Just looking at all the folks who signed up for this presentation, everyone's coming from really different places. We have folks who are maybe running GSAs at their schools and are thinking about providing them virtually, maybe individual mental health providers, folks who are just running groups on their own in the places that they live in. And so we're going to do our best to get to a lot of the kind of general questions coming in, but we definitely won't have all the answers, particularly around some of the legal pieces that come with working with youth. I know there were some questions about HIPAA laws and school guidelines, and so we'll do our best to provide some guidance around that, but we definitely won't have all the answers. And the other piece I wanted to name too is that what we're going to share in this presentation is really just one model for how we are utilizing a virtual space for the youth that we work with. And so I name that just to say that there might be pieces from this that are helpful for you, and then there might be pieces that aren't, and just to hold that there are a lot of folks doing work in an online space. And so this is just kind of the one way that we've seen and felt like it works for our audience, but there are definitely lots of different ways that you can kind of adapt this into the work that you're doing. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about just gender spectrum as a whole, and I wanted to have a few minutes just to share a little bit about what our background is in online programming. And I'm going to start off by just showing this quick video. This is a video of our online groups for teens, and we use this kind of similar model for our groups with preteens and also for our groups with parents and family members.
Hi everyone, welcome to Gender Spectrum's online panel discussion. When I first joined the calls, I was very lost in who I was, and I really was able to understand that I'm valid and that my life and my narrative is valid. And as funny as it sounds, like just me getting on the call for an hour on a Monday night really helped that.
Basically, it just gave me a space to talk about my gender in a really pressure-free zone with people who could really understand what I was going through because they were the same age as me, and a lot of them had similar experiences.
These groups are like totally non-judgmental. You can have whatever pronouns you want. You can say, hey, I'm going by a different name now. I'm going by different pronouns now. It's all about relating our life experiences to each other and just hanging out and having a friendly, safe space.
Whenever I'm outside, I'm always on guard and making sure I'm keeping myself safe and protecting myself. But here I really can relax and I'm not anxious.
At any given meeting, there were about 9 to 12 kids from all over the United States.
We talk a lot about just how our weeks at school have been going, stuff that's stressing us out, stuff that made us happy. You don't have to even talk about your experience with gender.
And I think that community was super important for me as I was going through some difficult life things that weren't even related to my gender. But overall, I think the most important thing was it was a really safe space.
There's lots of ways to participate. You can have your camera on and see people face to face. You can have your camera off and just be talking through the microphone. You can also send chats, which is a lot more comfortable for some people if they're closeted or they don't feel safe.
I live in San Antonio, Texas, and because of the area that I live in, I am very limited to my resources when it comes to physically being able to be with someone who has a similar identity as mine. Gender Spectrum gives me those resources that I need, although they aren't in a real life scenario. It is something that I can still get that good connection with someone else, and that's what I love about it.
When there's an organization like this and groups like these, it makes it a lot easier to learn from real people versus having to figure it all out by yourself, which can be really scary and high pressure. You can feel like you don't necessarily have anyone with you in the experience. These groups are to let you know that you have people with you.
As long as you're here respecting everyone's identities, you're welcome to be here. And we're here for you.
Anyone who's thinking of joining one, I would say go for it. And if you take that chance, you might make some lifelong friends.
Aren't those kids so cute? I love that video. I wanted to show that just because it's a little bit more of a visual of kind of what our groups actually look like, how we structure them, and how participants can really interact and participate on the video calls. So we've been running those groups for about 4 years, and we've expanded them to also, we offer them for teens, for preteens. We also use that similar model and provide resources around online groups for parents as well. We have a really adorable group for grandparents, a Spanish speaking group, really kind of trying to provide resources and connection and community for anyone who is either navigating their gender as a young person or supporting a loved one who's navigating their gender. And for us, we run all of our groups on Zoom. I think for some folks that will be a platform that would work for you, and it's definitely not the only one. I know some people use Google Hangout. There's a lot of different platforms you can use, but we're going to talk through in this presentation a little bit about why the features on Zoom have worked pretty well for us and kind of why that platform makes sense for the work that we're doing. All of our groups are also specifically focused on gender. We definitely talk about intersections with sexual orientation, but just to name for you all that for us, that's really our focus. But I think a lot of the ways that we're running these groups can definitely be tailored for any groups that you're doing for LGBTQ plus youth. And then all of our groups always have a trained facilitator on the calls. Most of our groups are now run by trained volunteers. Some of our groups are still run by staff, but we always have someone on the call who is the kind of designated facilitator. And then for our groups, we do some that are more general. So we have like general teen, preteen groups for kind of anyone who's like has questions about their gender, is navigating gender. And then we also do some like identity specific groups. So like right now we have a group for API parents. We've run some specific youth of color groups for our teens. So we kind of go back and forth between that in terms of sort of how we structure our groups. And then the other kind of piece to our online programming is we also have the Gender Spectrum Lounge. And so this is a little bit different than our online groups. It's not run through Zoom, and it's more of just like a forum type text space that folks can use. It's definitely where we see a lot of our parents being really active. I think, you know, for some folks being able to be really anonymous in the things that they post and the questions that they have might actually be a better space for them than maybe being on a video call and having to, you know, answer questions in real time. But that's also a resource that we definitely utilize. Okay, so we're going to dive into some of this content. Definitely one of the questions we got was around kind of what is good about online spaces, what can be challenging. And so we wanted to share a little bit of what we've learned along the way that I think hopefully will be helpful for you all. So starting with some of the benefits, definitely I think one of the biggest benefits is just the increased access. I think it eliminates a lot of roadblocks being able to provide something in an online space. I know for a lot of us, we're probably very familiar with working with queer youth who maybe have need support with mental health or maybe navigating anxiety or depression. And so for the groups, I think it's really nice that the online space just kind of eliminates a little bit more of that pressure. Also for like our teen group, a lot of the teens who joined are not out to their parents. They're maybe not talking about their gender with anyone outside of the group. So there's also increased access in terms of, you know, if you're not coming from a family that's super supportive yet, you're still able to kind of access an online space. And also just the piece around cost, right? Like there's most youth have access to either the internet or a phone. And so I think there are in some ways some benefits to not having to like figure out transportation to get somewhere in person. Just eliminate some of those roadblocks. Another benefit that we found for the online spaces is that you really can provide multiple avenues for young people to participate. And that is something that we've gotten a lot of consistent positive feedback around. One of the reasons that we use Zoom is because the youth can join by audio, video, or chat. And we really encourage them to join in whatever way feels most comfortable for them. And that is a piece of feedback we've gotten from a lot of youth, whether they used the chat maybe for one group and then they felt more comfortable and they turned their video on. Just providing those different mechanisms for them to participate so that it isn't, you know, kind of like a one size fits all for every youth. Like I mentioned earlier, the online groups can be really great for youth with anxiety. That was one of the main reasons that we started running online groups, is that we would hear from a lot of folks like, we're running this in-person group for trans youth, but like no one is showing up. And we really felt like there has to be a way to kind of bridge that. And so we've seen that I think the online space can just sometimes feel a little bit more comfortable for youth to start out with. And then I think the last piece that's really great about online spaces is that it does allow us to kind of provide support for youth during this really critical and stressful time. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I think a lot of folks are feeling an urgency around, supporting the youth that they care about. And so the online space really does allow you to kind of put something together pretty quickly and at least maybe provide support in the meantime. And then also the last thing is that one thing I really like is that I feel like online spaces can really be adapted and sort of shifted based on what your needs are. So as we go through some of these slides, I would encourage you to just think about like, how might some of this fit for the work that I'm doing? How might it not? Are there ways that I can adjust it? And, we've definitely shifted and adjusted a lot of our online programming over the years. And I feel like that's always necessary. And it's really nice to be able to do that. Okay, so with all of the benefits of online spaces, there are definitely also some challenges. And I think these are important to highlight as you all might be diving into some of this work. So one of the big challenges that I think can take a little bit of time to kind of come around to is that online spaces really just are not the same as in person. And I think if you go into it really wanting your online space to feel exactly like how it feels in person, you're just kind of setting yourself up for disappointment. And it's not always that it's worse online, it's just different. I think there are just different dynamics. For some youth, an online space might be way better than in person. For some youth, an in-person might just have a lot more connection for them, but just holding that like it's gonna feel different, it's just not gonna feel the same as in person. Another challenge, which I know some folks asked about beforehand, was around reading the room. I think that can definitely be difficult for our teens, particularly. They're not always the most expressive. And so you have to kind of think through like, what are creative ways to allow folks to participate? For our groups that we do on Zoom, like we'll just try and think of different ways. Maybe it's like, hey, everyone put a smiley face in the chat if you want to keep talking about this topic, or thumbs up, thumbs in the middle, thumbs down around how you're feeling right now with this activity. Just like checking in a little bit more with folks, I think can be helpful. Another challenge can be sometimes providing one-on-one support. I think for a lot of us, we've been in environments where maybe there's a youth who just needs a little bit extra help or needs some one-on-one time to check in. And it's a little challenging, right? You can't just be like, hey, let's step outside and go on a walk and, talk it out. And so we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but one of the things that we do is utilize the breakout rooms on Zoom. That's a feature that you can use to have one-on-one conversations outside of the larger group. And so there are definitely ways you can do that, but you just have to think a little bit more creatively about putting those things in place when you start. Another one is technology, right? Technology, I feel like, is amazing and a nightmare. And so, I feel like we've all been in that space where we've had a presentation ready to go and the slides don't work, or the internet doesn't work, or there's some challenge. And so we haven't had a ton of issues using Zoom in terms of like youth joining and not being able to figure out the technology. But I do think it is a piece that, it's not as comfortable for everyone. And there are some unpredictable pieces around if stuff maybe doesn't go exactly as planned. And then the last part around those challenges, which is vague, but I think is something important to talk about, is just that facilitation can be tricky in online spaces, and it's so, so important. And I think the tricky piece is just around some of the things we just mentioned of, reading the room and maybe not feeling like it's the same as in person. But, ultimately we want the online spaces to feel just as safe and affirming and, as comfortable as they are in person. And I think a lot of that is really up to the facilitator to kind of create and hold that space. And so even things like, wanting to make sure that everyone is able to be heard in an online space, that they're still gonna, you're still gonna respect their privacy and confidentiality, like a lot of the things that you would do in person, but just making sure that you're not like, oh, it's online, we don't need to do any of that. And just holding that, it is so important, the role of the facilitator in those spaces. Okay, so we've talked through a little bit around the benefits and challenges of online groups, and I know a lot of folks are probably now like, okay, what do I do? How do I facilitate in these online spaces? And so I like to think about it as there's still the core kind of pieces that you're going to hold the same as if it's in person. I think for so many of you who are listening to this presentation, you already probably have some experience with youth and some experience kind of like holding like a group setting. And then I think there are a few things that are particular to an online space that I wanted to just highlight a little bit. So the first one is definitely setting group agreements. I think for a lot of folks, they already probably do this in person. Group agreements are kind of like just sort of like the standards that you're going to hold throughout your group. They kind of give a little bit of structure in the spaces that you create. So group agreements might be things like confidentiality in the space, maybe the like make space, take space to make sure that everyone's getting to share. In my experience, youth like always have so many ideas about group agreements. So what we do in our groups is we always kind of have a set of group agreements, and then we open it up to the youth if they want to add any. And then we always post them in the chat. So they're kind of like at the top of the chat throughout the group. And I think the group agreements are just so important because they really make your job as a facilitator much easier and allow you to kind of like already have had just kind of the expectations set at the beginning. We also always provide links to additional resources. So I know a question that came up a lot in the webinar and when people signed up was just around supporting youth that have mental health needs. And so we always provide additional resources in the chat. The Trevor Project is one that we always put in because they have the 24/7 call or text feature. And so just having a few things like that, I think can be really helpful. And then another tip for facilitating is definitely utilizing what we said earlier, those Zoom breakout rooms. That is a feature that you can get on Zoom. And I think it's really, really helpful, especially if you're having groups where you might have more than like 10 to 15 youth. Being able to break them up, you can do like one-on-one conversations, you can do like groups of 3, you can kind of pick the size that you want. And then if you are the facilitator, you're able to kind of bounce around to each of those rooms. And so that can be really helpful for like having more engaging conversations. And then also definitely that piece of if there, is a youth that you want to talk to one-on-one, you can kind of just like hop over into a breakout room with them to have a more private conversation. And then a few other tips. So like I mentioned earlier, the feedback we've gotten is that youth really appreciate the joining by audio, video, or chat. And I think a key piece to that is that the facilitator really provides equal attention to like any way that you're joining the group. So an example of that can be, if someone puts in the chat, something they want to talk about is reading it out loud. So a facilitator might be like, hey, Susie just said, I want to talk about coming out to my parents. Does anyone have advice? So just like making those folks feel heard and seen in whatever way that they are participating. I think that can be really important. And oftentimes some of our youth who are like the quietest youth on the calls are the ones afterwards who email us being like, that was amazing. It was so great. So really just, allowing everyone to participate in the ways that feel most comfortable for them. Another tip, which I'm sure folks have when they're in person, but I think online is extra important, is just coming over prepared with icebreakers and activities. I think just you never know on the internet, like what's going to work, what isn't. I think especially if you're doing these groups for the first time and maybe youth are not used to doing groups online, an activity that might take way longer in person might go way quicker on the internet or vice versa. So we are in a few minutes going to go over some different activities, but just coming over prepared, I think, can be really helpful. And then the last piece, which I just want to highlight, is that really holding that self-care is so important for all of us who are facilitating. I think especially during this difficult time, right, for a lot of us, we're also queer, trans, and we are, might be losing access to our own community, right? A lot of us are also isolating in our own spaces. And so I think holding that self-care piece is so important. And I think specifically too in online spaces, um, obviously not everyone will feel this way, but some of the feedback we get from our facilitators is that it can sometimes feel a little bit jarring to like have this, really deep personal group you're facilitating, and then you just kind of like close your computer and it's over. You don't really have the same like wind down that I think you do in some of the in-person groups. So I think just like holding that, if that's how you're feeling after a group, and just, remembering to be really kind and gentle with yourself. We might have youth during this time that are having more mental health needs than they might typically, or are feeling extra vulnerable because they're in a space that's not super supportive of their identities. And so just holding that, like, that's a lot for us as facilitators, and also holding like, how great is it that you all are so committed to these youth that you're wanting to so quickly switch to providing resources in a digital space. Okay, so this kind of ties in a little bit to the things I just talked about, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time just sharing what to know about Zoom. And I recognize that for some folks, they might not choose Zoom as a platform, and that's totally fine. Definitely thinking about what works best for your audience. But these are just a few of the features that a lot of other platforms also have that we've found to be really helpful. So the first one I'm going to start with is the mute unmute. This can be kind of challenging because on Zoom, often when you get to like a size of more than 10 people, there can be a lot of echoing, there can be a lot of like people trying to talk over each other. And so as a facilitator, knowing kind of how to mute and unmute folks, and kind of naming at the beginning, like we'll say a lot to the youth, like, hey, looks like we have a bigger group today. So we're actually going to start out with folks muting themselves, and just unmute if you want to share. And you don't always have to do that. Sometimes the size isn't an issue. Another challenge can be if youth are joining from maybe a public space or somewhere where there's a lot of background noise. You might have to just individually chat that person and just say, FYI, I'm going to mute you because it's really loud, but just unmute yourself when you want to share. That's definitely a helpful thing to know. The breakout rooms, I'm not going to talk too much about this because we kind of already went over it, but I feel like it's definitely a great feature to utilize and also just know is available. We are definitely going to probably start using it more for our groups, because just in this past week, we had like 25 teens at our group, about 20 preteens. And so if they get much bigger than that, we're not really going to be able to keep them all in one space. So it's just helpful to know that that's there. Another feature that's great is the chat box, for a few different reasons. One is like, it's just nice that you can obviously participate in that way if you're a participant. But another thing that's great is that you can chat either individual people on the call or the group as a whole. And so if there is a youth that maybe you're wanting to check in with, make sure they're doing okay, you can also just individually chat them, and no one else can see that chat that's happening. The other kind of flip side for that feature that's really nice is oftentimes some of the best conversations we've had with youth have come out of them just sending topics they want to talk about to the facilitator, and then the facilitator can kind of bring them up anonymously. And so oftentimes we'll start our group with like, at any point, if there's something you want to talk about but you don't want to bring it up, just chat me, and I'll be the one to bring it up. It can be really nice. Okay, a few other features. This one I think has been really great for our group. So on Zoom, there is a way to update your name that kind of comes up on the screen. And so we use that as a way to put in your name and pronouns, if you use specific pronouns, at the beginning of all of our groups. And it's really nice because you can change it every time. You can change it throughout the call. For us, we really kind of focus on the groups being a space where youth can like explore their gender. They don't have to have it all figured out. And so we don't really assume at each group that someone's using the same pronouns as the group before. Oftentimes we'll kind of see them shift. And as a facilitator, it's really nice to not have to remember everyone's pronouns and name, especially for our groups. Like, we have different youth joining each group. So that's just something I like to highlight as something we kind of adapt for our groups. And then the last feature that can be great is that you can do screen sharing on Zoom. This has kind of been challenging for us a few times when we've had preteens that want to screen share like this YouTube video they're watching, or just like something that they want to show the group. But it can be really nice if maybe you are like doing an online hangout and you all want to watch a video together, or you want to listen to music, or kind of, if there are ways you're wanting to make it more interactive, that can be something that's really helpful. Okay, so I sprinkled in throughout this presentation a lot of questions that came in the sign up forms. We had about 600 people sign up, so there was a lot of questions. So I tried to kind of break them down into different themes that came up, and kind of hit on a lot of the points that we felt were important as well. So this was one question that came in, which says, what are ways to protect youth and adults in online spaces? Privacy, safe environment, guidelines, etc. I think that's such a great question. It's so important as we create these spaces to still be thinking about kind of all the same things that we think about in person, around making sure that they are safe for youth or safe for adults who are, if you're doing a group for parents or adults as well. So we're going to focus in on just a few key things that I think are kind of core pieces to make sure that your groups are protecting youth in these online spaces. So the first one is sign up forms. We don't really publicly give out any information about with a link to like directly join any of our groups. So we don't post on Instagram like, hey, join Zoom at this time for the group, here's the link. We always have a sign up form so that there's kind of an extra step. It does add a little bit of like admin on your end, but I think it's really, really important to make sure that everyone who's joining the groups has the right intentions to be there, and that you're just creating that safety for folks. So the second piece to the sign up forms is also just being really thoughtful around what data you collect, especially if it's for youth. If you are running these groups and you're kind of thinking that you're probably only going to run them in the time being, right? Maybe you're just wanting to provide something in a digital space until things are kind of back to our regular day to day. I would encourage folks to just think about collecting what is really the crucial data that you need for the groups. Especially with queer and trans youth, I think it's really important to not collect too much data on them, right? We never know really how protected the data is that we collect. So things that I think are important are getting obviously some sort of name, some sort of contact information. And that's really important because if something does come up in a group or in an online space, you really want to know that you're able to reach out to that youth afterwards if needed. And then it can be helpful to have maybe one question that's a little bit more, like takes a little bit of time to answer, so that you can field out if there's anyone who maybe isn't really joining because they actually want to be in this space. So maybe it's like, why do you want to join the group? What are you hoping to get out of the group? Or just some sort of question that can help you field to make sure you know that they're actually a youth. I would actually add to this also asking for age. I think that's one thing that we look at a lot, is like anytime someone signs up for our groups, we have someone on our team that looks over that form. And sometimes that we get youth who are too young or too old. So asking those things can be helpful. And then definitely that piece of wanting to be able to reach back out if something does come up, if there's a mental health concern. So we do a lot of like text reminders to the youth that sign up. And so sometimes we'll follow up by text afterwards. So you can think about that, but you can also have something like an email just so you can reach out. And then I think the third part around the protecting youth in these online spaces does really go back to also the group agreements. Being really clear up front and throughout around things like privacy, confidentiality, like whatever you feel are the things that are important to make a youth feel held and safe in that space. Making sure that you provide that and you kind of set the tone at the beginning of the groups. So yeah, sign up forms, the data that you collect on those sign up forms, and setting some sort of group agreements at the beginning. Okay, so on the webinar, we had a lot of folks being like, what are activities we can do? Can you share with us activities? So, and this was a question we got beforehand as well. So we're gonna talk a little bit around tips for activities that can be done online. And this is definitely something that I think will just depend on your group and the audience that you're working with. So I think the first thing when you're thinking about activities is really to identify like what is the biggest need of your online space, and what are kind of the unique dynamics that you hold. For example, like, do all the youth already know each other? Are you a GSA where the youth have already met in person and now you're kind of just moving it to online? Are you going to have new youth who don't know each other? Like for our groups, we have different youth every time. So like, is there a trust level that needs to be built? I think another thing to think about is like, do you want to structure it specifically as a support group, or do you want to structure it more as like a hangout space? For us, our groups are much more focused on just like hanging out and discussions. Um, Obviously some like heavy and deep topics come up around that, but for us that's what we do, and obviously for each of you just thinking through what what makes sense for your audience. And then the last piece is really thinking about like, how are folks going to participate and do so, like what do your activities need to accommodate? For us, definitely a flip side that's a challenge of the audio, video, and chat is like thinking through what are activities that anyone can do who's joining through that, through those three different kind of routes. And so it's, you just have to think kind of creatively about what can that look like. Okay, so I'm just going to share a couple activities that have worked well for us. I'm sure you all have plenty of activities too that you've used in the past. This is a picture of me with my dog Prince. One of the activities I've learned over the years that's very popular with both preteens and teens is the pet appearances. So I think one thing that's really cool about doing online groups is that you do kind of get to see youth in a different setting. You kind of get to see this like whole different side of them because they're not like in a school space, they're not at an LGBT center. A lot of them are like in their room, they're in places that are really important to them. And so I think a way to utilize that is really honing in on those pieces. So I think definitely the pet appearances, I mean, those happen without even structured activities. You'll just have a kid like all of a sudden they're like holding up a lizard, or there's like a bird on their shoulder. But I think those are ways where you can really engage in conversations about like, oh, let's all go around and share our pets, and what does your pet mean to you? Or just kind of silly things like that. In connection to that, we've also done different activities around like show and tell. With like both the teens and preteens, that's been pretty popular. You can sometimes we've done show and tell related to gender, like maybe it's like, hey, bring something to the group that is important to you and your gender, or like, hey, we're all going to take 30 seconds and go find something. um, I think those things can be really fun. We also do a lot of just kind of icebreaker type questions, which you all probably know tons of different activities, and a lot of them can be done in an online space. You might just need to think through like a little bit of the nuances of those. So some of the activity, like the icebreakers we've done are obviously making sure they remain age appropriate, but we've done things like two truths and a lie. That's one the preteens really like. Rosebud thorn, where you just kind of talk about like something you're looking forward to, maybe something that's gone well in your week and something that's been challenging. I know in the last week a lot of youth have been talking about kind of like the highs and lows of quarantine and isolation, and so any ways that you can kind of like ask questions like that, I think can be helpful kind of conversation starters. And like I mentioned earlier, definitely one that I think is good is like the anonymous question. So if the youth feel comfortable chatting to you as the facilitator, anonymous questions that they want to talk about, some of our like deepest and most powerful conversations have been from that, because it's topics maybe you can have a sense that like a lot of kids want to talk about it, but no one really wants to be the one to bring it up. So keeping that kind of like remaining open throughout your groups or online spaces can be great. And we've also done groups that are kind of like art activity based. You can definitely think about like if you're kind of straying away from doing like a traditional support group, and maybe your groups are more hangout spaces at school or at LGBT centers. We've definitely done activities online. You can have someone come and like present a topic to youth. I'm like definitely thinking about doing some sort of like makeup challenge or different things in some of our upcoming groups. So I think the key piece there obviously is just like making sure you give a heads up beforehand if there are supplies that are going to be needed, and really thinking through like who is the audience of your groups. Like, are they going to have access to those supplies? I wouldn't do the activities if you think that there'll be kids on the call who maybe are not going to have access to things like pen and paper or, whatever you need. But you know your group's best and your audience best. So just kind of think through what might work best for you all. So these are just a few activities. I think you all probably have more than you even think in the back of your brain. So just thinking through how to kind of adapt them into an online space, I think is really the key piece. Okay, and so this, I'm pretty sure this was the last question that we put into the slides. And this question was around how do we keep queer and trans youth in these spaces safe when homophobic and transphobic people have access? And I wasn't sure exactly if this question meant like have access like in the home because maybe they're in the background of the home, or like have access because online spaces, anyone can kind of find them in some way. So we're going to address, I think, both parts of that question. So, and I think that's such a great question to ask and think about. I think definitely this is a challenging time because while for some youth, right, an online space might be more accessible, it might be easier for them to join than in person, or for whatever reason, it might be a better fit. There are also those youth where now having to join something from home might be really scary, might be really stressful. Instead of joining a group at school where there's no chance that their parents are going to see, now they might be like joining this group from their room and their parent is like in the kitchen, like right by them. So I definitely think it's important to kind of hold like the complexities of that and all the different kind of like dynamics that youth might have in the space that they're in that we can't really see when they're on, in an online space. So I think one thing around kind of keeping these spaces safe is really the piece around providing different mechanisms for participants to participate. And so, for some youth that join our groups, they will just use the chat, not so much because that's what they want to do, but because then no one can hear them in their house. And that's like a way for them to still connect, but it's safe for them. Some youth will like just use the chat and turn their video on, but leave their audio off so that they don't have to talk. And so I think that's just an important piece to hold is like, is there a way that a youth could join that maybe feels more safe to them? Maybe it's not ideal, but it still gives them this connection to other people. I think another piece that's really important and can be kind of hard to name is really supporting youth and assessing like, is this environment actually safe enough for them? And the reality is that for some youth, like it just might not be. It might not be safe for them to join a group like this and be, in a home with people who are not really affirming who they are. And so I think just holding that and thinking through if you're doing a group where like you have a pretty solid relationship with the youth that you think would be joining, really talking that through with them and and recognizing that that just might be the reality, unfortunately, for some youth. And so the online space just might not be a good fit. I think you can think about like maybe there's a youth from the group you can connect them with and they can text back and forth or, but, just thinking through that reality. Another piece is that for a lot of our groups, youth will join not from their home. You can join Zoom through, they have a mobile app also, and also like a call-in number. So sometimes we'll have youth join from like a park. Obviously, access to spaces right now is going to be a little bit limited, but if they can even just go on a walk and maybe call into the group, maybe join from like an outside setting somewhere, that can definitely be helpful for young people. And then I think the last piece, like we've mentioned earlier, is really just being cautious about how publicly you're sharing information about the groups, particularly like the login information. So not as much like your promotion of the groups, but just thinking through like, are you posting these things in a space that's really easy for people to find? Do you have that piece in place where maybe there's a sign up form beforehand, like just making sure that it's not so easily accessible that like a lot of people might join that are not obviously there for the right intentions. Okay, and I wanted to hit on a few other resources for folks as we wrap up some of the presentation. One thing that I think is really helpful to know is that a lot of the platforms that you can use for kind of creating these online spaces have a lot of tutorials on YouTube and on their website. So if you feel like maybe Zoom is a good fit for you, but you are now feeling very overwhelmed by the tech side of things, I would definitely encourage you to look on their YouTube page. I think they're also adding things pretty frequently right now just because of the increased demand. But that's kind of how we learned a lot of the different features on Zoom, was just sort of going through a lot of the videos and like kind of like, you know, picking the things that felt helpful for us and the things that maybe weren't so relevant. Okay, and then a few other resources that I wanted to highlight in addition. So one program that I haven't really talked about is Gender Spectrum runs a facilitator support group. So we run this group, we meet the first Thursday of every month. And we started it because we really felt like there were a lot of folks out there who were running like um, groups for youth or parents, whether they're LGBT groups or gender-based groups, both in person and online, but that a lot of folks didn't really have support around running their groups. And so we kind of joke that it's like a support group for people who run support groups. And I think like during this time, this might just be a really great resource for folks. We kind of talk about all different things. We rotate, so every other month we have a presenter come in to kind of talk about like a different topic around gender. And then the flip side, the other month we just do kind of a general check-in. And it can be helpful just to kind of share like what's going well in your groups, where are you feeling stuck, you know, did you do an activity that just went really well and you want to share it with other people? Or maybe you're like, I need more activities. Like I don't know what to do with my groups. So it does meet next Thursday. I will put a link in the email that goes out to everyone with the sign up form for that. Where the topic that we're going to talk about next week is really just kind of checking in about how is everyone doing during this time, and then kind of specifically focus on online groups. So if people are kind of in the process of trying to provide something virtually, how's it going? What questions do you have? So if you have more questions after this webinar, I would definitely encourage you to sign up for that and join us next week. And we meet on Zoom and you're able to, it's like an interactive meeting. So you're able to kind of have your video and audio on, and can be a nice way just to also connect with one another. Another resource that I wanted to highlight is this Training for Change group. I'm actually in their online training series right now. They do a lot of professional development trainings and they have a whole section on basically kind of building your skills in online spaces. I've found it to be super, super helpful. So I think if you're feeling like you definitely are going to move some things into a digital space, but you're a little bit overwhelmed maybe by like the technology piece or making it all happen, I would definitely encourage you to check out Training for Change. There's also a link in here to some HIPAA laws. I know that we didn't get to any of that in real detail. It's a little bit challenging because a lot of it's also based on the state that you're in and kind of the institution that you're connected to. So I would encourage you all to look there if you have specific questions about if you're a mental health provider and you have kind of HIPAA laws and you need to think through that and the platform that works best for you. I also wanted to mention that if you are feeling like maybe this is, I know for some folks, the digital work is definitely not going to be something they're doing long term. It's maybe just kind of filling the gap for right now. But I also know there are other organizations and individuals who are really wanting to maybe do this more throughout the year, maybe add it into like the programming that they offer to youth. And so I just say that to encourage you all to please reach out to us if you are wanting to do kind of deeper work around this. You know, we've really just sort of scratched the surface of what all of this online work looks like, and we're happy to kind of talk with you about consulting and one-on-one ways that we can kind of support you in doing that work. And lastly, I just wanted to do a quick plug. We definitely wanted to provide this resource for everyone and not have a mandatory fee for it. I feel like this information is so important during this time. That being said, we are definitely hoping to increase the groups that we are running and the online services that we're providing just to meet the needs during this time. So we do encourage you, if you have taken anything away from this presentation, if you're going to share this recording with other folks in your organization, if you're able to, that you give us a sliding scale donation. And we have provided a link on here. You can go to genderspectrum.org/donate. Okay, and I've also provided my email. So if anyone has additional questions, please feel free to send me an email if you want clarification on anything, if you need to be pointed in the right direction. Please feel free to send me an email. I'm really happy to help you. Okay, I feel like we just got through a lot of material. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. I hope that it was helpful for you all. We have a few more minutes, and I'm kind of looking through some of the additional questions that came in yesterday through the chat. My amazing colleague Yarrow was on our webinar yesterday and was like responding to questions constantly that came in, was really holding down all the chats that came in. So I'm just kind of looking at it to see if there's any additional questions through there that would be helpful for you all. Someone asked, are youth discussions facilitated by an adult? Our model, we always have, our volunteer facilitators are always 18 and over. Honestly, most of our adult facilitators are a little bit older than that because we run groups from 13 to 19. So I'd say most of our facilitators for our adult groups are definitely at least in their mid-20s. Someone also asked, with younger participants, has tech use ever been a challenge, or do you find that they're able to navigate Zoom fairly easily? I love this question because I definitely feel like what we've learned is that like the youth are so much better at using the technology than any of the facilitators or adults really are. So sometimes the parents may have issues like setting them up the first time, but honestly, once they're set up, we really haven't had that many issues with Zoom. We usually encourage folks to get on maybe 5 minutes beforehand so that they have a little bit of time to troubleshoot. Let me see. Okay, another question we got yesterday, which I think is a really important one. We kind of touched on it, but it was, how do you balance spreading the word broadly so that people who may need the service will find it without having trolls or non-affirming people joining to cause trouble? This is definitely like always my biggest fear, is that, with anything you do in an online space, you just have a little bit less control over people's access to it. And so I think definitely the piece of having a sign up form beforehand. Luckily, we haven't had anyone in our groups yet, like knock on wood, that has been in there for the wrong reasons. But there have been a few people that we fielded out kind of through the sign up form. Maybe they don't fill it out all the way, or just like we don't get a great vibe from the form. You can tell that it's not really a youth that filled it out. And so I think all of those things are really important. You can also, there also are some like additional features on Zoom, and you can think through like if any of them, kind of how important it is to you and your group. There's like ways you can set a password for the meeting. So not only do they need the link to join, but they also need the password. For some folks, I think that can be helpful. Another thing that I like to hold with the groups is that on Zoom, you do have the ability to like kick someone out at any point in a meeting and block them. So luckily, we've never had to do that, but I think it can be helpful just to know that that's there in case you did ever need it. If you started a group and right away you can tell that someone's in there that you don't want in there. Let's see, what else? A lot of these questions we kind of answered. Someone asked, do you accept folks from outside the US? Yes, we do. And we have had a lot of international youth join our groups. Just recently, this story is so cute. We had, for our preteen group, they have to be 10, 11, and 12. And we had a preteen join from India. So it was like 5:30 a.m. their time. and the parent emailed us saying that he was just so excited to join because it was his birthday and he had just turned 10. And so, yes, we definitely get international folks. The time difference is just the kind of the challenge. Let's see. Someone asked, can Zoom work on a mobile phone? Yes, you can definitely use the app on the mobile phone. And then you can also provide a call-in number too. So if they don't have the app, they can call in. There were so many questions. A lot of them were just kind of technical questions. One thing also that we do in our group, there are some questions in here around kind of following up related to mental health concerns, if anything comes up in a group. And for all of our groups, because staff are not always running them, we have a form that facilitators have to fill out after every group. It's pretty simple, but there's a few questions in there around like, did anything come up with any youth? Is there any youth that need follow-up? Did any topics come up that are concerning? And that really allows for us to be able to follow up as soon as possible if there is anything that needs follow-up or additional support. Another question that came in yesterday was around, is it advisable to have at least 2 facilitators in case of technical difficulties? And for most of our groups, we only have 1 facilitator, but there is someone on Gender Spectrum's team who's kind of like on call during the groups. We were sharing yesterday that there was a time when we had a technical issue with Zoom. And so someone on our team had to facilitate a group from like the parking lot of Trader Joe's. So I would say, yes, it's definitely like best case scenario is that you can have 2 people on the call. I think it can definitely help having one person kind of do the tech piece and maybe one person can focus more on the facilitating. But for most of our groups, like when we have, 15 kids or less, the facilitators typically say that it's fine, that they didn't really feel like they needed additional support. So I think if you have that, that's great. But not always necessary. Okay, and one last question on here that came in I think is really important and kind of speaks to what we talked about earlier. Someone asked, has any participant not participated, kind of like right to pass? Has that felt different in an online group? And I love this question because I think it's so important to kind of highlight. So we definitely have youth who join our groups who do not talk at all the entire time. Like maybe they have their video and audio off, maybe they call in and just listen in. And I think it's so important to allow for youth who want to participate in that way to feel comfortable doing that. When I think about kind of why we started our online groups, it was really because of like, hearing from youth that maybe they were like, I know there's this GSA at my school, but I'm just never going to feel comfortable joining it. Like, I'm just not at a place where I feel, I'm just too nervous to join that. Or, for a lot of our groups that are specifically around gender, part of why we did the audio video chat option is that a lot of youth who join our groups are maybe not at a place where their gender expression really aligns with like their internal identity and their internal sense of who they are. And so allowing them to participate and use the pronouns that they want to use and use the name that they want to use, but not having to maybe show their face is a really game changer for them to be able to feel like it's okay to explore their gender and figure things out. And so I think for some youth who you might have that join that are completely silent, it's like that might be really what they need at that moment. Right, just listening in, taking in what other people are saying. I think also the piece of like, we really don't know the environment that a lot of youth are in when they join these groups. So someone who might be calling in and is super quiet, it might be because they aren't able to talk out loud, or they aren't in a place where, they really want to communicate how they're feeling. They just want to listen to other people. So I definitely that has happened before, and I think part of it is also just being as a facilitator being comfortable with the silence, and holding that they're taking from the group what they need. I always joke that like we do feedback forms after a lot of our groups, and so sometimes the feedback we'll get from a kid will be like, it was amazing, it was so great, like I felt like I could totally be myself, and the facilitator will be like, oh my gosh, that kid didn't talk one time, like I thought they were having a terrible time, I'm so glad that they enjoyed the group. So definitely think that just goes back to that piece of like really respecting whatever way that youth want to participate. Okay, so I think that was most of the questions that came in beforehand. Thank you so, so much for tuning in to this presentation. I felt like my heart was so full seeing how many people signed up for this and just how many, folks are really wanting to support the youth in their lives that might be going through an even more challenging time right now. So thank you so much for joining. Again, we will be sending out with this an email with a lot of links to some of the different resources that we mentioned. If you have any specific questions that are not either answered in this or the links are not provided that you need, please feel free to reach out to me and we can definitely connect. Thank you all so much. I hope everyone stays healthy and safe, and remember to take care of yourself during this time, and look out for an email from us. Thank you. Bye.